Have you ever gotten tired of waiting on God and decided, you know what? I'll just handle this myself? Genesis 16 is what happens when that decision goes terribly wrong. We've got bad decisions, drama, insane side eye, baby mama drama, a whole angel showing up, and eventually the birth of a wild child. But underneath it all is a very human problem. God made a promise. The promise was taken too long, and Sarah got tired of waiting. Welcome to another episode of BS with me, where BS always means Bible study. My name is Eddie, and today we are diving into Genesis chapter 16. Now, Genesis 16 is filled with lots of lessons that we can learn from and begin to build some of our history on as we continue to study. When we open up this chapter, we're focused on Sarah, Abram's wife, who is sick and tired of being sick and tired. She is aware that God has promised children. She is aware that God made this covenant with Abram, but like many things God has promised us, it's not happening on our time schedule. So she's overwaiting. Before I read the chapter, I want us to think about our lives. I want us to think about the things that we are praying for and how often we get impatient waiting for God to release things into our lives. I've had several things in my life that I prayed for show up much later than when I expected it, much later than I wanted it. And more often than not, it's nowhere near how I expected it to be. So I can recognize the space that she's in as she's dealing with this in Genesis 16. When we study this chapter, it's easy to see Sarah as the bad guy, Abram as like a passive husband, and Hagar as like this unwilling victim. But I want to reinsert some humanity into this story. These are all just adults doing the best they can, even in the disobedience, even in the harsh choices that are made in this story. These are people just like you and me. Every one of us have had the same types of mistakes trying to do what we think is right and have to suffer the consequences of getting it wrong. With that in mind, we're going to start chapter 16. We're going to read verse 1 through verse 6 just to get started. I'm going to be reading out of my NIV, but you can read out of whatever version resonates with you. What's important is that you are reading your Bible. Now, Genesis 16:1. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept us from having children. Go sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarah said, and after Abram had been living in Canaan for 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her to her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." All right, a lot of things just happened. Sarai is overweighting. We talked about how in a previous episode, there's a lot of cultural importance to having children during this time. We still see it today. Having children is still seen as a success marker for our lives, but back then it was even more so. The inability to have children was seen as like divine punishment, proof that you or one of your ancestors had done something wrong to prevent the continuation of your lineage. So Sarah is a relatively wealthy woman. She's got status, clout, and yet those around her, she's accomplished nothing because she has not fulfilled the life goal of having children. She's not been blessed in that way. That can eat at a person, feeling like they are far behind their peers or the people that they consider themselves better than. You can look and see that same kind of rhetoric in our lives today. Oh, you're at a certain age and you don't have a house, you're not married, no kids, still in debt. These social markers don't hold the same weight for us because we don't often put the same religious connotation behind them. But you can take a look at how single women in the church are treated, how there is such a high emphasis on Christian women to find a husband and be a wife. And we can go down an entire rabbit hole how we do not put that same emphasis on men and how we do not effectually teach men how to be husbands in the first place. But we can save that for another episode. What we are discussing today is the social and religious pressure to hit those milestones in this day and age. Sarah's overwaiting for God. Her response is to roll up her sleeves and to solve the problem herself by getting her husband to take Hagar, her servant, whom they were gifted upon when they were leaving Egypt. Her plan is to have a child through her. Now, this sounds insane to us. Outside of like a planned and structured surrogacy, we do not have anything that comes close to what at this time was a normal cultural process. This process, the plan was to have Hagar have the child and it would become Sarah's, period. That was something that was very common in culturally in this day and age. Most would assume that this cheat code would not solve her cultural or religious pressure to have a child, but at the time, this would have worked and solved all of Sarah's problems. In fact, she's looking at it as the way that this was the answer to what God promised. But unfortunately, it does not turn out that way. So let's talk Abram for a bit. He's been promised specifically that he will have children. God has made a covenant with him specifically, and yet when it came time for this plan, Abram listened to his wife and did as she asked. As a husband, I want to be mad at Abram. Like, why would you do this when God specifically himself spoke to you? But as a man living in the world with a wife, I get it. He wants a child too, and his wife is sick and tired of being sick and tired. So he did it. This was still poor leadership on his part, and the Bible does not tell us if he refused 100 times and gave in at the last moment, or if he heard it for the first time and was like, shoot, let's go for it. This is probably what God wanted. All right, family, quick break. If you want to go deeper into your own Bible study, I put together a free resource library with the books, the commentaries, and the study tools that I use to even prepare for these videos. You can get it for free in the link in the description. Until next time, God bless, read your Bible. The point that needs to be addressed is how Abram was not only being disobedient in this, but the impact a man's wife has on him. It's ultimately his responsibility, much like Adam receiving the responsibility not to eat from the tree. This is not going to be one of those blame the wife situations because it was Abram's responsibility to hold it down. And he failed at that task, trying to keep peace in his house, trying to keep his wife happy. Now, Hagar does as instructed, follows the plan. She gets pregnant and immediately starts to give her boss the side eye. Rude. Yes. But here she is looking at this powerful woman who, from her perspective, can't handle the basic role of womanhood. So she had to do it for her. Pride and jealousy are a real curse that befalls us all, right? Hagar has been able to do what Sarai cannot. And just like that, she is feeling superior to her own boss. Sarai, of course, wants none of this. And again, goes to Abram on some whole, like, check your side piece, this isn't cool type energy, right? She's fairly upset that things are not turning out the way she wanted. However, I still got to point out this was her plan. We see this all the time in our own lives. We enact our plan instead of the Lord's plan. I often refer to this story when I find myself ready to execute on something that I've not really been given clearance on to move just yet, but I really want to get started on something. I really want to move on it. But I want to touch on this as an aside note. There is such a thing as passive discernment or spiritualized hesitation. This is when people find themselves using fear to hold them back from doing something that they need to be doing, waiting on God to make some grand gesture to tell them to move. Like, oh, I need to be doing this, but Lord, just like, I need you to give me one more sign to do this thing that you told me to do. And you get into this spiritualized hesitation where you don't move the way you're supposed to, with Hagar harshly. Now, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, the term harshly can also be translated as into she humbled Hagar. Now, based on the words used and the anger that was present, I'm quite sure she was not nice about it. So much so that Hagar fled. She is an Egyptian and she's about to go back to Egypt so she can have this baby. Now, we're going to continue through the rest of the chapter and see what happens along the way. We're going to pick up at verse 7. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was a spring that was beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from and where are you going? I am running away from my mistress Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, Go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Laha Roy. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son that she had bore. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. Hagar is on the run, and she is stopped by an angel. One of the things I found interesting about this interaction was that the angel called her by name, who she worked for, and yet still asked where she was going as if he didn't already know. This reminds me of God's question to Adam in the garden after he'd eaten the fruit. It's not that God nor the angel didn't know the answer. It is more about our heart posture when we are asked this question. It is a challenge to think about, why am I even asking this question? For example, when I walk into my kitchen and I see one of my kids with his hand buried in a box of Girl Scout cookies, I ask, what are you doing? I'm not asking him because I'm unsure about what I'm seeing. I'm asking him because I need him to think about what it is that he's doing and ask himself, why would I be questioning him about what he's doing right now? The angel asks where she is coming from and where she is going. Hagar ignores the question about where she is going and leans into her feelings of fear, hurt, and anguish. She's telling the truth. But even in the presence of the angel, she feels like she needs to be validated in her choices. I am fleeing from my mistress. What is she communicating? She's running from someone that's supposed to care for her. She's running from a place she's supposed to belong. She's running from the responsibilities she has to her mistress. Understanding the context is what makes her response make more sense to us. She's a servant. She's supposed to be working for her mistress and submitting to her mistress and bears that responsibility. In turn, her mistress is responsible for her and her well being. To be in a state where she is fleeing is communicating that things have gotten terribly wrong. So that she would rather risk being alone in the desert than being back with her because she no longer feels safe. However, the angel sends her back, reminding her of her responsibility and with a blessing, no less, right before the Lord spoke with her. The Lord had listened, named her son Ishmael, and he said that he was going to be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand would be against everyone. And in this case, Abram gets his son. He gets Ishmael. He gets what he thinks he wanted the entire time. If I remember correctly, he was 86 years old by the time he has his first son. 86 years old. Abram feels like he got what he wanted. Sarah thinks she got what she wanted at the entire time, but not the way that God wanted it for him. But she feels like she got what she wanted. When we learn more about the individual Ishmael becomes and the strife that he has with Isaac, his brother, who is the actual promised son, we will see the cost of stepping outside of God's will. But there's so much turmoil and strife that comes when we decide to move on our own volition. Maybe you're waiting on God right now. Maybe you're getting tired of waiting. Genesis 16 warns us about what happens when we become so desperate for God's promise that we start trying to manufacture it ourselves. But it should also remind us of something else. God still showed up in all that mess. He found Hagar in the wilderness. He heard her suffering. And even though Abram and Sarah's decisions created consequences that would outlive them, their failure did not stop God from accomplishing what he had promised. So don't confuse waiting with doing nothing. Move when God has given you something to do, but don't become so impatient for the outcome that you start trying to do God's part for him. Sometimes faith isn't believing that God can do what he promised. Sometimes faith is trusting him enough to let him decide when and how he does it.